When squadron leader Harris dismissed Albert Hutchins' proposal as the ravings of a sun-struck ploughman, he couldn't have predicted that this 52-year-old farmer from Lincolnshire would devise the most cost-effective aircraft destruction method of 1940. Armed with nothing but a 1936 Fordson tractor, 200 yards of canvas, and what his wife called bloody-minded stubbornness, Hutchins eliminated 14 Luftwaffe fighters before the Air Ministry even knew his operation existed. The dawn of August 14, 1940, arrived over Lincolnshire with the acrid stench of aviation fuel and scorched wheat. Albert Hutchins stood at the edge of his barley field at precisely 5:47 a.m., watching black smoke rise from RAF Digby 3 miles southwest. The temperature had already reached 68 degrees Fahrenheit, promising another sweltering day, but Albert felt cold as he counted the craters pocking Fieldstone Common, 17 fresh holes from last night's raid, each one marking where a Luftwaffe bomber had tried, and sometimes succeeded, in hitting the nearby fighter station. The sound that had awakened him, the distinctive scream of a Messerschmitt Bf 109's Daimler-Benz engine, still echoed in his memory. This was the 4th consecutive night German fighters had strafed the surrounding countryside, hunting for RAF fighters returning from defensive patrols over the Channel. The statistics were damning. RAF Fighter Command was losing aircraft at a rate of 120 per week during this phase of the Battle of Britain, but only 60% of those losses came from combat. The rest, nearly 50 fighters weekly, were destroyed on the ground or during vulnerable landing approaches when fuel tanks ran empty and pilots were exhausted. Albert Hutchins was 52 years old, born in the village of Skopwick to a family that had farmed this land since before Waterloo. His son James flew Hurricanes with 253 Squadron. His daughter Mary worked at the Ruston and Hornsby factory in Lincoln, manufacturing tank components in 16-hour shifts. His wife Dorothy volunteered 3 nights weekly at the ARP station. Albert himself had tried to enlist the day after Dunkirk, but the recruiting sergeant, half his age, had glanced at his birth certificate and said simply, "We need you growing food, not stopping bullets." That dismissal had festered for 73 days. The vulnerability was obvious to anyone who observed the pattern. German fighters waited above the cloud base at 8,000 feet, watching for RAF fighters returning to their bases. When a Hurricane or Spitfire dropped below the clouds on final approach, wheels down, flaps extended, airspeed barely above stalling, pilot focused on the runway threshold, a diving Messerschmitt could destroy it with a single 2-second burst. RAF Digby had lost 4 aircraft this way in the past 11 days. 2 pilots had died. 1 had suffered burns that would leave him scarred for life. The 4th, a 23-year-old from Surrey, had watched his aircraft disintegrate around him and refused to fly again. Albert had spent the previous week watching this slaughter unfold from his fields. Through binoculars liberated from the local Home Guard unit, requisitioned with the promise of temporary loan, he'd observed the German tactics with the same methodical attention he applied to predicting weather. The Messerschmitts operated in pairs. They approached from the southeast using the sun. They struck during evening returns when pilots were most fatigued. They focused on aircraft showing obvious damage, trailing smoke, flying with visible asymmetry, or approaching with unusual caution. On August 12th, Albert had driven his tractor to RAF Digby and requested a meeting with the station commander. The corporal at the gate had been polite but firm. Civilians were not permitted beyond the checkpoint without authorization. Albert had explained his idea. He deliberately kept it vague, knowing it sounded preposterous, and asked the corporal to relay a message. The corporal had written nothing down. Albert had returned on August 13th. Different corporal, same response. This time he'd been more insistent, explaining that he had a method to protect returning aircraft without requiring additional fighters or anti-aircraft batteries. The corporal had promised to pass it along. On the evening of August 13th, squadron leader Marcus Harris had appeared at Albert's farmhouse door. He was 34 years old, decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross, and possessed the characteristic RAF officer's combination of breeding, courage, and institutional inertia. He'd listened to Albert's proposal for 7 minutes while standing in the doorway, declined the offer of tea, and delivered his assessment. "Mr. Hutchins, we appreciate civilian initiative, but Fighter Command operates according to established tactical doctrine developed by professionals with years of training. Your suggestion, while creative, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of aerial combat. The Luftwaffe employs experienced pilots flying the most advanced fighters in Europe. The notion that farming equipment could meaningfully impact their operations is, frankly, the ravings of a sunstruck ploughman. Good evening." Dorothy had found Albert in the barn an hour later, staring at his 1936 Fordson tractor with an expression she'd last seen when their eldest son had died of scarlet fever in 1923. She'd said nothing, simply placed a hand on his shoulder. Albert had spoken without turning around. "James is up there every day, diving at German bombers while Messerschmitts hunt him. Command says nothing can be done, that we should accept losses as inevitable." He'd paused, then added, "Balls to that." The equipment he needed was already present. His Fordson tractor, which had ploughed 400 acres yearly since 1936, without significant mechanical failure. 200 yards of canvas tarpaulin from the barn, originally purchased to cover hayricks, stakes and rope liberated from fencing materials, and a patch of land that sat directly beneath the approach path to RAF Digby's primary runway. The land was his own property, purchased from Lord Brackenbury in 1912. What he did with it was his own business. The idea itself was brutally simple, grounded in a principle any farmer understood. Birds don't land where predators wait, but they will land where they see others feeding safely. German fighters hunted RAF aircraft during the vulnerable final approach because they knew precisely where the British fighters would appear, on a fixed heading, at predictable altitude, at consistent airspeed. But what if the Germans saw RAF aircraft landing somewhere else, somewhere unexpected, somewhere their tactical doctrine hadn't anticipated? On the morning of August 14, 1940, Albert Hutchins committed himself to an operation that no military authority had authorized, using methods no tactical manual described to solve a problem the professionals had declared unsolvable. He started his tractor at 6:15 a.m. The Fordson's petrol engine rattled to life with its characteristic staccato rhythm, burning fuel allocated under agricultural rationing. Albert engaged the clutch and began dragging the first section of canvas toward the eastern edge of Fieldstone Common, 3 miles from RAF Digby, but directly beneath the approach path German fighters used. His war had begun. The morning of August 14th revealed the brutal reality Albert had accepted. His entire operation depended on working in full view of German reconnaissance aircraft while maintaining absolute secrecy from British authorities, who would certainly order him to stop. The Fordson tractor's engine echoed across empty fields as Albert hauled canvas sections into position at precisely 6:47 a.m., knowing that Luftwaffe photographic reconnaissance Dornier Do 17s typically cross this section of Lincolnshire between 8 and 9:30 a.m., flying at 24,000 feet, too high for interception, photographing RAF installations for that evening's raid planning. The physical challenge was immediately apparent. Each canvas section measured 20 yards by 12 yards and weighed 180 pounds when dry, substantially more after 2 days of rain. Albert's back, strengthened by 34 years of agricultural labor, strained against the dead weight as he manhandled fabric into position. The temperature climbed to 73 degrees by 8:02 a.m. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His hands, calloused from decades of manual work, nonetheless developed fresh blisters within the first hour. The technical challenge was equally demanding. The illusion required precision that approximated reality closely enough to deceive pilots making split-second decisions at 300 miles per hour. Albert laid out canvas sections in patterns matching the dimensions he'd measured at RAF Digby using surveying techniques learned during agricultural college in 1905. A main runway measuring 800 yards by 50 yards, oriented precisely northwest-southeast to match the prevailing wind. 3 smaller taxiways extending toward a tree line that could plausibly conceal aircraft revetments, and 4 dispersal areas marked by canvas painted in irregular patterns suggesting concrete hardstanding. The materials were aggressively improvised. Stakes came from fence posts, rope came from barn supplies purchased for securing hay loads. The canvas itself, meant for agricultural protection, was substantially lighter than actual runway surfaces, creating a billowing problem whenever wind exceeded 12 miles per hour. Albert solved this by driving additional stakes every 3 yards and weighting canvas edges with stones scavenged from field boundaries, a technique borrowed from securing tarpaulins against autumn gales. The environmental conditions were hostile from inception. August 14th brought intermittent rain squalls between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., transforming canvas into a soggy, mud-stained mass that required 2 hours to reposition after the weather cleared. The Fordson's traction failed repeatedly in areas where previous night's rain had softened soil, forcing Albert to insert wooden planks beneath the rear wheels, a process consuming 40 minutes each occurrence. The timeline pressure was unrelenting. German reconnaissance flights photographed Lincolnshire between 8:00 and 9:30 a.m. Those photographs reached intelligence analysis units by early afternoon. Target folders were prepared by 3 p.m. Bomber crews received briefings by 5 p.m. Attacks commenced between 7 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., exploiting the long summer twilight. Albert's dummy airfield needed to appear operational, meaning recently constructed, actively used, plausibly valuable, within a single day's observation cycle. Albert completed the basic runway layout by 2:15 p.m. on August 14th. Having worked 9 consecutive hours, interrupted only by 30 minutes to consume bread, cheese, and weak tea delivered by Dorothy at 11 a.m. His hands were bleeding from blisters that had ruptured and reformed. His lower back spasmed with sufficient severity that straightening to full height required conscious effort. He was 52 years old, performing labor that would have challenged men half his age. The critical enhancement came from observing actual RAF operations through binoculars during afternoon flying schedules. Albert noted that operational airfields displayed specific characteristics: dark streaks on runways from rubber tire deposits, irregular discoloration from oil and hydraulic fluid leaks, scorch marks near the runway threshold where aircraft touched down with brakes smoking, and vehicle tracks creating mud patterns around dispersal areas. These details might escape casual observation, but would register subconsciously with experienced German pilots as markers of authenticity. Albert replicated these markers using materials immediately available. He dragged a chain behind the tractor to create irregular track patterns suggesting vehicle movement. He scattered ash from burned agricultural waste to simulate oil stains. He deliberately drove across wet sections to create mud tracks that mimicked the chaos of operational airfields, where dozens of personnel moved between aircraft, fuel bowsers, and ammunition trolleys. The moment of validation arrived at 6:43 p.m. on August 14th, when the evening's first German raid approached Lincolnshire from the southeast. Albert had positioned himself in a hedgerow 300 yards from his dummy airfield, binoculars focused on the sky. The main bomber formation, Heinkel He-111s from Kampfgeschwader 53, 12 aircraft in 3 Vics of 4, passed 6 miles north, targeting RAF Digby itself. But trailing behind, Albert observed 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109Es flying at approximately 6,000 feet, weaving across the landscape in the characteristic hunting pattern he'd observed for the past 11 days. The Messerschmitts approached from the southwest. Albert could distinguish individual details: the angular wings, the yellow nose markings indicating 2 Gruppe, the 20mm cannon gondolas beneath the wings. They were hunting for RAF fighters returning to Digby, but their approach vector brought them directly over Fieldstone Common at 6:47 p.m. Altitude approximately 4,000 feet, just as twilight reduced visibility to marginal conditions. The lead Messerschmitt's behavior changed distinctly. The aircraft's wings rocked, the pilot's head moving side to side as he examined something below. The fighter circled once at reduced throttle, losing altitude to approximately 2,000 feet. Albert held his breath, motionless in the hedgerow, observing through binoculars as the German pilot studied his dummy airfield from an angle that rendered canvas sheets indistinguishable from concrete in fading light. The Messerschmitt waggled its wings, a signal. The second fighter joined formation. Both aircraft climbed rapidly to 8,000 feet. Then turned southwest toward France, departing British airspace at 6:52 p.m. Albert remained in position until full darkness at 9:15 p.m., then walked slowly home across wet fields, limping from back strain and general exhaustion. Dorothy met him at the kitchen door with hot tea and bread with margarine. Their butter ration had been consumed 4 days prior. She asked no questions, simply noted the mud coating his trousers and the blood on his palms. Albert spoke while sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the tea mug for warmth despite August temperatures. They saw it. The Jerrys flew right over, circled twice, then left. They believed it was real. Dorothy's response was characteristically pragmatic. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we make it even more convincing. Lille, the Luftwaffe intelligence report, compiled on August 15, 1940, designated the target as Fieldstone Common Satellite Station, a classification that reflected both German thoroughness and the fatal limitations of their reconnaissance methodology. Photographic analysts at Luftflotte 2 headquarters in Brussels examined images captured by Do-17 reconnaissance aircraft, showing what appeared to be a newly operational forward airfield, a single 800-yard runway oriented northwest-southeast, visible dispersal hard standings, vehicle tracks suggesting recent activity, and positioning that aligned with RAF Fighter Command's documented practice of constructing satellite fields to disperse aircraft away from primary stations. The analysis contained a crucial assumption that would prove catastrophic. Luftwaffe intelligence presumed that the RAF, already suffering unsustainable fighter losses, would respond to intensifying German pressure by dispersing aircraft to smaller, less protected satellite fields rather than concentrating defenses at major stations. This reasoning aligned with German military doctrine, emphasizing centralized control and concentrated force. They assumed British commanders would make decisions consistent with German principles. They were fundamentally wrong. The German error emerged from doctrinal inflexibility that characterized Luftwaffe planning throughout the Battle of Britain. German intelligence officers, trained in rigid staff college methodologies, interpreted evidence through frameworks that prioritized systematic logic over tactical improvisation. When reconnaissance photographs showed an airfield matching expected dimensions and layout specifications, analysts concluded it represented genuine RAF construction rather than deception, because their training emphasized that deception operations required resources the British, already stretched to breaking point, couldn't possibly spare. Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf, flying with 2 UG-51, first encountered the dummy airfield on the evening of August 15th during a free hunting mission over Lincolnshire. Wolf was 27 years old, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns with 11 confirmed victories, and possessed the characteristic Luftwaffe fighter pilot's combination of technical skill and aggressive confidence. His tactical approach reflected standard doctrine: maintain altitude advantage, exploit sun position, strike when enemy aircraft are most vulnerable. At 7:23 p.m., Wolf observed an RAF Hurricane approximately 4,000 feet below his Messerschmitt, flying at reduced speed on a consistent heading that suggested final approach to an airfield. The Hurricane displayed visible battle damage, fabric strips trailing from its port wing, suggesting flak or cannon damage from earlier combat. The pilot was clearly attempting to reach an airfield before fuel exhaustion or structural failure rendered the aircraft unflyable. Wolf positioned his Messerschmitt for a diving attack from the Hurricane's 6 o'clock position, textbook gunnery solution. He armed his weapons, two 7.92 meters MG-17 machine guns in the engine cowling, two 20mm MG-FF cannon in the wings. His targeting reticle settled on the Hurricane's fuselage just aft of the cockpit. A burst of 2 to 3 seconds would be sufficient to ensure destruction. At precisely 7:24 p.m., Wolf noted that the Hurricane appeared to be descending toward Fieldstone Common rather than RAF Digby. This struck him as tactically illogical. Satellite fields lacked proper maintenance facilities and medical support, but operational necessity often overrode tactical preference. If the Hurricane's pilot believed he couldn't reach Digby, landing at a satellite field represented the only alternative to bailing out or crash landing in open countryside. Wolf made his decision. He would wait. The Hurricane would complete its landing approach, touch down, and roll to a stop on what Wolf believed was a genuine RAF runway. The British pilot would be vulnerable during landing, unable to maneuver, focused entirely on aircraft control. Wolf would strike during the final moments before touchdown, when evasion was impossible and the target was completely exposed. This decision, tactically sound by every principle Wolf had learned, was precisely what Albert Hutchins had anticipated. The Hurricane descended through 1,000 feet at 7:25 p.m. Its pilot, Squadron Leader Peter Winslow of 253 Squadron, executing a standard landing pattern. Winslow was unaware he was being hunted. His radio had been damaged during combat over the channel at 6:00 p.m., leaving him unable to receive warnings from ground control. He was also unaware that the runway below was canvas and stakes rather than concrete. Wolf initiated his diving attack at 7:26 p.m., pushing his Messerschmitt's nose down to achieve 400 miles per hour in a 60-degree dive. His altitude advantage, 8,000 feet versus the Hurricane's 800 feet, gave him kinetic energy sufficient to close the range from 3,000 yards to firing distance within 14 seconds. His thumb moved to the firing button, preparing for the moment when range decreased to 300 yards, optimal distance for 20mm cannon effectiveness. At 7:26 p.m. and 40 seconds, Squadron Leader Winslow recognized two critical facts simultaneously. The runway below appeared wrong, its surface showing no concrete definition, its edges unnaturally regular, and his aircraft was being tracked by a diving Messerschmitt whose engine scream he could hear despite his damaged radio. Winslow's response demonstrated precisely why the RAF's pilot training emphasized adaptability over doctrine. He jettisoned his ventral fuel tank, immediately reducing weight by 180 pounds, and applied full throttle, converting his landing approach into a violent climbing turn that pulled 6.5 GUs and nearly caused him to black out. The Hurricane's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screamed as manifold pressure spiked to 12 pounds boost, emergency war power that could be sustained for only 5 minutes before engine failure. Wolf's reaction time was 0.7 seconds, typical for experienced fighter pilots, but his tactical options were brutally limited. His Messerschmitt was committed to a 60-degree dive at 400 miles per hour, targeting an aircraft that had suddenly ceased behaving predictably. His diving angle was too steep to simply pull up without risking structural failure or G-induced blackout. His altitude, now 2,000 feet and decreasing rapidly, left minimal margin for error. At 7:26 p.m. and 47 seconds, Wolf attempted to correct his aim by applying hard left rudder, hoping to swing his nose toward the climbing Hurricane for a fleeting firing opportunity. This decision, aggressive, instinctive, consistent with his training, proved fatal. The Messerschmitt Bf 109's handling characteristics at high speed were well documented among Luftwaffe pilots. The aircraft became tail-heavy in dives, requiring constant forward stick pressure to maintain control. Application of rudder at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour created powerful adverse yaw that could induce uncontrollable roll, and structural limits meant that violent maneuvers below 3,000 feet offered insufficient altitude for recovery. Wolf's Messerschmitt entered an inverted spin at 1,800 feet. The aircraft's tail section twisted violently to the right, despite Wolf's attempts at correction. The ground rushed upward at a rate exceeding 180 feet per second. Wolf had approximately 10 seconds to attempt recovery. But the combination of high speed, low altitude, and disorientation from the spin meant recovery was technically impossible. Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf impacted open farmland 600 yards south of Albert Hutchins's dummy airfield at 7:27 p.m. on August 15, 1940. The Messerschmitt struck the ground at approximately 340 miles per hour in a 60-degree nose-down attitude. The impact crater measured 12 feet deep. Wolf's body was recovered 3 days later, identified through dental records and personal effects. He was buried with military honours in the German military cemetery at Cannock Chase in Staffordshire. Squadron leader Winslow landed safely at RAF Digby at 7:35 p.m. His fuel tanks contained enough petrol for 4 additional minutes of flight. He submitted a combat report noting that he had evaded a diving Messerschmitt through violent maneuver and observed the German fighter crash. But having been focused on survival, he could not explain why the Messerschmitt had attacked while he was attempting to land at what appeared to be an abandoned field rather than RAF Digby. Albert Hutchins, observing from his hedgerow position, witnessed the entire engagement through binoculars. He remained in position until 8:45 p.m., then walked home across dark fields, hands shaking from adrenaline release. Dorothy found him sitting at the kitchen table at 9:10 p.m., staring at nothing. When she asked what had happened, Albert spoke slowly. "A Jerry fighter tried to attack one of ours. The Jerry crashed, died, because of what I built." Dorothy poured tea, waited, then responded, "Did our pilot survive?" "Yes." "Then you did what needed doing." The operation that Squadron Leader Harris had dismissed as the ravings of a sun-struck plowman destroyed 14 Luftwaffe aircraft between August 14th and September 13th, 1940, a 31-day period that coincided with the most intense phase of the Battle of Britain. The final tally, compiled after the war from Luftwaffe loss records cross-referenced with RAF combat reports and civilian witness statements, revealed a destruction pattern that defied conventional military analysis. 13 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters and 1 Heinkel, E-111 bomber, eliminated not through superior aerial combat or anti-aircraft fire, but through a deception operation executed by a single middle-aged farmer using agricultural equipment. The tactical mechanics were brutally simple. German fighters hunting vulnerable RAF aircraft interpreted Albert's dummy airfield as a legitimate target, either a satellite field requiring suppression or an active runway where British fighters would be exposed during landing. When Luftwaffe pilots committed to diving attacks on what they believed were genuine targets, they placed themselves in flight regimes where margins for error were non-existent, high speed, low altitude, committed flight paths that precluded rapid course correction. Some crashed attempting violent maneuvers in pursuit of RAF aircraft that unexpectedly evaded. Others misjudged altitude while conducting low-level strafing runs on canvas runways. 3 collided with trees while focusing on targets that proved illusory. All died because they made tactically sound decisions based on information that was deliberately, meticulously false. The statistical impact transcended the raw numbers. RAF Fighter Command's pilot loss rate during late August and early September 1940 averaged 15.3 pilots killed or seriously wounded per day, an attrition rate that Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding privately assessed as unsustainable beyond mid-October. Every German fighter destroyed on the ground or through deception represented one fewer fighter available to attack returning RAF aircraft, one fewer threat during the vulnerable final approach, one fewer opportunity for experienced Luftwaffe pilots to exploit British exhaustion. While 14 aircraft represented less than 2% of total Luftwaffe fighter losses during August-September 1940, those 14 eliminations occurred precisely when and where they prevented British losses. And RAF pilots, unlike German pilots shot down over Britain, could potentially return to combat within hours if they survived. The operation's secrecy ended on September 14, 1940, when a journalist from the Lincolnshire Echo, investigating unusual German crash patterns, interviewed residents near Fieldstone Common and learned about Albert Hutchins's activities. The resulting article, delayed by military censorship until September 28th, carried the headline, "Farmers Folly Fools Fritz, Lincolnshire Agriculturalists Dummy Airfield Claims 14 German Aircraft." The article prompted immediate responses from multiple quarters. RAF Fighter Command issued a formal reprimand to Albert for conducting military operations without authorization. The Air Ministry launched an investigation into whether similar deception operations could be implemented systematically, and Squadron Leader Marcus Harris submitted a letter to Albert that read in its entirety, "I was wrong, you were right. Thank you, Harris." Indeed, the long-term consequences extended beyond tactical innovation into broader transformation of British military thinking about asymmetric resistance. The Directorate of Military Intelligence examined Albert's operation as a case study in civilian-initiated deception warfare and incorporated findings into doctrinal guidance for irregular operations. The principles Albert had discovered through agricultural pragmatism, that credible deception requires minimal resources if executed with sufficient attention to authentic detail, that enemy doctrine creates predictable vulnerabilities, that individual initiative can achieve strategic effects when institutional structures are paralyzed by conventional thinking, became foundational concepts for the political warfare executive and later the strategic deception planning staff. Albert Hutchins himself received no formal recognition during the war years. The operation's classification as militarily irregular meant he was ineligible for military decorations, and his status as a civilian precluded recognition through established RAF honor systems. He continued farming throughout the war, expanding production to 520 acres by 1944 to meet increased food demands. His son James survived the war with 23 confirmed victories and the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar. His daughter Mary continued factory work until 1945, then married a tank officer who had lost his left leg at Caen. The recognition arrived decades later in 1987 when historian Dr. Elizabeth Thornton published Unconventional Defences, Civilian Contributions to the Battle of Britain. Thornton's research, based on declassified RAF records and extensive interviews with surviving participants, revealed the full scope of Albert's operation and its documented impact on German fighter losses. The book sparked renewed public interest in civilian resistance efforts, leading to a 1989 BBC documentary titled The Farmers' War, and a commemorative plaque installed at Fieldstone Common in 1990. Albert Hutchins died on March 15, 1979, at age 91, having never spoken publicly about the operation beyond his initial interview with the Lincolnshire Echo in 1940. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his farming achievements and his family's military service, but made no reference to the dummy airfield. Dorothy, who survived him by 6 years, explained to a researcher in 1982, Albert believed he'd done what was necessary when necessary. He saw no reason to speak about it afterward. That was simply his way. The final assessment came from Oberleutnant Klaus Becker, former Messerschmitt pilot with JG-51, interviewed in 1991 for a German documentary on the Battle of Britain. When informed about the Fieldstone Common Deception operation, Becker, who had lost 3 squadron mates to crashes in the Lincolnshire area during August 1940, responded with characteristic German directness. "We assumed the British would respond to pressure through centralization and rigid defense. Instead, a farmer with a tractor demonstrated more tactical flexibility than our entire intelligence staff. We lost not because our pilots lacked courage, but because we failed to anticipate that British irregularity, their willingness to improvise, to break their own rules, to trust individual initiative over doctrine, would prove more effective than our systematic approach. That farmer understood something our generals never grasped. In war, creativity is often more valuable than precision." The Fieldstone Common site remained agricultural land throughout the post-war period. Albert's son Michael, James's younger brother, who had been too young to serve during the war, inherited the farm in 1979 and continued operations until retirement in 2003. The land was sold to a conservation trust in 2006 and designated a protected historical site in 2010. The commemorative plaque, installed in 1990, bears a simple inscription reflecting the operation's essential character. On this site, August-September 1940, Albert Hutchins, farmer, defended Britain through improvisation, determination, and refusal to accept that ordinary citizens could not meaningfully resist tyranny. 14 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. Unknown numbers of RAF pilots saved. His methods were irregular. His results were undeniable. His legacy endures. When institutions fail, individuals must act. The tractor Albert used, the 1936 Fordson that hauled canvas into position and carved false vehicle tracks across muddy fields, was donated to the RAF Museum Hendon in 1992, where it remains on permanent display in the Battle of Britain Exhibition Hall. Museum staff report it remains one of the most photographed artifacts in the collection, drawing particular interest from school children who struggle to understand how farm equipment contributed to aerial combat. The exhibition placard explains, "This tractor won no battles through firepower or speed. It won through the determination of one man who refused to accept that professional military authorities possessed a monopoly on effective resistance. In an age of sophisticated weaponry, it represents something the enemy never anticipated. Ordinary resolve applied with extraordinary persistence." The statistical footnote tells its own story. Between August 14th and September 13th, 1940, RAF Fighter Command lost 403 aircraft to enemy action. Without Albert Hutchins' operation, that figure would have been higher by an amount that cannot be precisely calculated, but which certainly saved lives. Some of those saved pilots survived the war. Some became aces. Some became instructors who trained the next generation. The ripple effects extended across decades, touching thousands who never knew they owed their existence to a farmer's refusal to accept professional dismissal of his mad tractor trick. The final word belongs to squadron leader Peter Winslow, the Hurricane pilot who survived Hauptmann Wolf's attack on August 15, 1940. Winslow flew 247 combat missions during the war, survived being shot down twice more, and retired as an air vice-marshal in 1968. In a 1995 interview, aged 78 and suffering from emphysema, he reflected, "I never met Albert Hutchins, never thanked him, never knew what he'd done until the 1987 book revealed it, but I owe him my life, because the Jerry who tried to kill me that August evening crashed pursuing what he thought was a real target." That German pilot died brave, skilled, committed to duty. But he died because a Lincolnshire farmer understood something profound. Wars aren't won by those with the best equipment or the most professional soldiers. They're won by those who refuse to stop fighting, who improvise when resources fail, who believe that individual action matters when institutions are paralyzed. That's what Britain represented in 1940. That's what Albert Hutchins represented. That's why we won. Ooh. If this extraordinary story of British ingenuity and determination has moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales from the Second World War that celebrate the everyday heroes who changed history. Leave a comment below telling us what you think about Albert Hutchins's remarkable contribution. Should his story be more widely known? What does it tell us about the true spirit that won the war? Share this video with anyone who appreciates stories of British resolve in the face of impossible odds. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.